Hello, everyone. We're so happy that you're here with us. We'll get started in just a moment. Hello, and welcome to tonight's Black History Experience keynote address with our featured speaker, Ty Simpson. I'm Marlo Daly Galliano, Associate Professor of English at Lewis Clark State College. To start this evening's proceedings, we ask you to consider the land where you are. We acknowledge that we all gather today on Indigenous homelands. At LC State, in Seminicum, we are on the Indigenous homelands of the Nimipu, the Nez Perce tribe. We acknowledge the Nimipu as original caretakers since time immemorial and recognize their continuing connection to the land, to the water, and to their ancestors. We wish to take this opportunity to express our deepest appreciation and respect for the ongoing relationship built between Lewis Clark State College and the Nez Perce tribe. Ketsiao. And we'd like to thank you for attending this Black History Experience event at LC State. The Black History Experience at LC State seeks to offer a safe, welcoming, and inclusive space for learning and sharing, guided by the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We hope that you will actively seek to challenge any personal biases, assumptions, and preconceived stereotypes, and approach differences with openness and curiosity. We are very excited about the events that we have put together to celebrate Black History Experience. I'd like to recognize my fellow committee members, Dr. Sarah Graham, Amy Minervini, Emmanuel Che, and Max Galliano, and our sponsors, Rose Hill Estate, LCSC Center for Arts and History, LCSC Humanities Division, LCSC Center for Teaching and Learning, and the LCSC Library. Thank you for being here today as we amplify Black voices and hear our speakers' individual stories. Following the keynote address, there will be time for questions. Please submit any questions you have to the YouTube chat. If you have any problems with the chat, you can also email questions to me, hmdalygalliano@lcsc.edu. And now a little about our speaker. The storyteller is Ty Simpson's name in the Indigenous language of the Nimipu Nation. As a direct descendant of Chief Red Heart, Ty takes great pride in serving her community as an organizer, activist, and advocate. Ty catalyzed her racial and social justice activism while studying sociology and political philosophy and public law at Boise State University. Her experience at Boise State prepared her for the work she does in the community today. She also attended Lewis Clark State College, and we are so happy to welcome her back virtually for tonight's talk. Ty is an organizer for the Indigenous Idaho Alliance, which drafted the proclamations for Indigenous Peoples Day for the state of Idaho and the city of Boise. The Alliance also helped to draft the resolution acknowledging missing and murdered Indigenous Peoples Day that passed in the Idaho legislature last March. As a social change associate with the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence, Ty focuses on violence prevention and response within Idaho's tribal communities. As an anti-racism activist and community leader, she uses contemporary and traditional Indigenous storytelling to depict the lens of old ways and how they protect the sacred, build strength in the community, and keep nature in balance. These principles support her work to champion radical inclusion, equity, and liberation. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Ty. We look forward to hearing you speak.
Thank y'all so much for having me. This is such a great opportunity and an honor. I love the invitation to come back to one of my alma maters and speak and share space with each of you. So where are we at? Like, I loosely prepared my keynote this evening because this was an opportunity to really just tell the story of my own life and how fascinating or boring it may or may not be to any of you. So here's where I'm at. Over the weekend, uh, I was able to visit Las Vegas. And I was telling Marlo before we got on the call that there's always something so depressing about getting on the airplane for that last leg of flight back into Idaho from whatever city it is. So that layover in whatever city. I happen to be laying over in Los Angeles. So there's just copious amounts of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. And I'm sitting at this gate with all of the white folks getting ready to come back to Idaho. It was really kind of like a disheartening experience after having been surrounded by people of color the whole time, being surrounded and blending in. There's some comfort in that, y'all. So that was just something that was mildly entertaining to me, something that really kind of sets the stage for the things that we'll talk about and the things I'll share with you this evening. I want to start with a couple of things before I jump right into an intro. Just listen briefly, take a deep breath and relax into your body. And I want you to listen to some of the things that have been said to me. And this is all, I'm going to say that these were all within the last like year and a half, 2 years max of things that are said to me. He said, "You're pretty for a Black girl." He said, "What are you mixed with?" He said, "You're strong for a girl." She said, "Where did you buy your hair?" And then she didn't believe me when I told her I grew it. She said, "Are you even enrolled?" Heifer, we're in the same family. Like, we literally share grandmothers, immediate family. He said, and this boy was 10, "You can't possibly be an Indian. You have an iPhone." In the next moment, his very white mother, who was chaperoning the field trip, sucked all of the air out of the room with her chagrin. I was entertained. She said, "You're not one of us. Look how dark you are." She said, "Well, you've got booty because you're half Black." He said, "You're only in school here because of affirmative action and the free money we give you." That one was, and you guessed it right, he was white. They said, "You speak so well," as opposed to another one said, "I like it when you wear your hair straight." And, like, it grows out of my hair curly, man. So I do care what to tell you. They said, "She's so angry." And I said, "Goddamn right, I'm angry. Have you not been paying attention to the world?" They said, "Oh, you're an Indian? Well, I'm 13.2876% Cherokee. I just don't have a card." And then I roll my eyes so loud, and then I tell them not to go cosmic on me. He said, "You're my first Black girlfriend." Y'all, it showed. He barely seasoned the food that he cooked for us to eat. It was offensive, really. And he was a Scorpio. I'm never going to do that again. Ja, inem winitwas atitwatit, sayapa winitwas Ty Simpson, inwas ni mipu aya inem nexasa huis to mina ilkanich, la loitza kina titwatit inach netza. So in my language, I just offered you an introduction. I told you what my name is. I told you that my name is the storyteller. I told you that the stories that I carry are not my own. I told you that I am a Nimipu woman, of a citizen of the Nez Perce tribe. And I told you that I'm happy to be here. I mean, most of our evening is going to be about identity and who I am in the world. And I hope that the thing that you take away is that you can be all of the things, that I am not the storyteller, like the singular only one, but that you are also storytellers and that you feel empowered to share your story in the world, especially if you are mixed race, Black and Indigenous, because y'all, it's an adventure out here. I want to share with you first, like, I'm a modest woman, but I'm a freak. I love wine. I love coffee. I love books and beads. reads and I collect them both. My resolution last year was to read at least 5 of my unread books before I bought more, but my pile of unread books increased by 20 before that rule took effect. And then I bought myself 20 more to treat myself. I'm a tornado and a hurricane, y'all, when they meet. I am love and I'm fury, that rage in the same spirit. I am complicated and I am serious. I love to laugh, but I am terrified of my own tears. I love big. I dream big. I talk loud, loud enough so you can both hear me and my ancestors in this voice. I listen with intensity so both me and my descendants can hear you. I hold the identities of being both Black and Indigenous. It's not only, my descendancy is not only that of being Indigenous, but being a descendant of Chief Red Heart and a long, powerful line of matriarchs. I feel pain and grief and outrage across my identities. I believe and know that systemic racism was the engine that built this country on stolen land, and that racism to this day acutely affects Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. I often feel joy and love and abundance across my identities. How blessed am I that I carry both matriarchal wisdom and Black girl magic in the same body. My existence across identities is an act of political defiance. I am the living, breathing, deeply powerful culmination of my ancestors' prayers. I do want to do a little bit more with our land acknowledgement this evening. So I would love for our time this evening to be empowered by the Indigenous ancestors on whose land we occupy. I know many of us are across Idaho. Some of you are primarily on my homeland, Nimipu country. But I'm broadcasting from the unceded territory of the Niwa and Numu nations, commonly known as Shoshone, Bannock, Paiute, and Yakima people. And we also know that Idaho, in addition to Nimipu and the Niwa and Numu nations, is on the homeland of the Shitsuwumsh and Kootenai nations as well. We need to do a little bit more with these land acknowledgements, though. They are powerful at many powerful introductions at many events, and they're often delivered by descendants of colonizers. They're progressive and they give everybody warm feelings, but the acknowledgement is a recognition of the dispossession of our homelands. Settler colonialism is an ongoing process and a system of power that perpetuates the loss of land by Indigenous people. Land acknowledgements are not the end of the conversation around settler colonialism, but the beginning. And that being said, if we had our land back, land acknowledgements would be rendered unnecessary. And I'll say that one more time for you. Land acknowledgements are unnecessary if we Indigenous people had our land back. We need to be returned as to our rightful place as the stewards and caretakers of this homeland. We have been keepers of the land for generations, many of our nations, with evidence of our caretaking for about 15,000 years. And so I hope this evening, where you are and where I am, that we raise our hands to these ancestors and to the land which provides for each of us. As mentioned, I work for the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. We work to interrupt and mitigate violence in Native American communities. I believe wholeheartedly, and I also know that addressing violence in Native communities is inextricably connected to the systems of oppression and racism in this country, which is why a facet of my work is anti-racism education. And y'all, let me tell you, there is not enough money in the world to sufficiently compensate folks who are actively engaged in transformative justice work, anti-oppression, or anti-racism education. I stay tired. I also co-founded the Indigenous Idaho Alliance. We are part of the resistance against political and social systems that adversely affect Indigenous nations in Idaho and neighboring states. And our work encompasses MMIW response, education, community care, and mutual aid, policy advocacy, and consultation. But what stands out about our work at the Alliance is the inclusivity, the purposeful inclusion of elders, youth, folks who identify as Indigenous from both North and South America, and two-spirit representation. Centering the voices of our relatives most adversely impacted by marginalizations are the ones energizing this work. I am the storyteller. I always say titwatit inachnetza, which means the stories that I carry are not my own. They are passed to me generation to generation, and the old stories belong to our ancestors. And my stories created in my lifetime belong to my descendants. So that's an important distinction to make. It's a way of honoring and honoring my ancestors and making sure that we recognize that a lot of sacrifices were made for me to be here. I was prayed and loved into existence. A little bit more about my identity, and then I want to break a couple of things down. I am also a champion for decolonization and land back initiatives. I believe in reparations. I believe in radical inclusivity and community care, and I believe in abolition. I believe that Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty are inextricably connected also, that there is no way to separate either of those issues, one, or disentangle one from the other. So when Black folks are liberated, Indigenous folks are as well, and vice versa. I do believe that Indigenous folks are adversely and incrementally more marginalized, but I'm not here to play oppression Olympics either. And that's a conversation that we can get into a little bit later. And so for all of these identities, I'm a storyteller. That's who I am as a person. So I want to be able to offer you some stories to illuminate some of these things that have taken place in my life. I at one point attended LCSC, where many of you are students and or faculty or administrators. While attending LCSC, I was taking a US history class or an American history of class of some sort. And during that time, I was always at war with my classmates and my professors when it comes to portraying accurate history and understanding history in a way that is told from both the colonizer and the colonized. And what tends to happen, not just at LCSC, but in universities across the board, anytime anything comes up about Blackness or Indigenousness, all heads, including the professor, swivel to usually the singular student of color in that classroom. And that happened to me. That happened to me more often, more times than I could count. So while college is supposed to be this beautiful, empowering experience where we're all dedicated to this new knowledge, what ended up being is extractive and painful and triggering because I was not affirmed in what I was learning. Who I am as a person, who my people are in history was not being affirmed. What was happening was we were being relegated to these ancient, historical, apolitical bodies, relics of the past, rather than the contemporary, thriving people that we are today. And when I say we, I mean both Black and Indigenous people. Recently, if we've been watching the news, we know that the United States is on this really strange, violent, and tenuous precipice regarding race relationships in the country, in our communities. And my work as an anti-racism educator, organizer, and activist lends itself to being on the front lines sometimes of those rallies, of those vigils, of those education and awareness events. And it also puts a target on my back, on my head, on my face, on my body. I have been the victim and survivor of assault by white supremacists and white nationalists. I am very often sent very lovely cards that look like wedding invitations that actually have death threats inside. I received a Valentine's last year. It was a beautiful Valentine's Day card that was actually threatening rape on the inside of the card. And they sent it to my work. In the summer of 2020, when we were rallying around the death of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, and so many more Black lives, my address was posted on a Facebook group. My home address was posted in a Facebook group of known white supremacist affiliates as an actual little motorcycle gang is what, I mean, I relegate it to little, but they were actually a very large motorcycle gang that are actually very dangerous as well. And I smile through that and I laugh through that because in Indian country, we believe that nothing is so serious it can't be laughed at. And also, at no point has anybody ever made physical contact with me in the face of these threats. At no point has anybody ever actually approached me person to person. The one time that did happen was an off chance. It wasn't planned, and it was randomly in like Riggins, Idaho. And so anybody can be a badass and a keyboard warrior, you know, behind a computer screen, right? Like, but what is the reality of those threats? And, you know, so it does keep my life interesting. I stay on my toes. I make sure my family is abreast of these very real and very live threats that are taking place in my life as a result of my work. And some other funny stories about my experiences in Idaho. I was taking an adventure. I was living in Lewiston at the time, and I was taking an adventure with a coworker, now very dear friend of mine. And we were coming to Boise to shop and to spend the weekend hanging out and having a good time. And on the way down, my very, very white friend, her car had a tail light and a headlight out. So driving through Idaho in the like in the nighttime, I think it was the winter time, but in the nighttime, with no headlights and no tail lights, we got stopped a couple of times. And every time was just this mind-blowing, fascinating experience to me because the cops were nice to her. And at one point, they alluded to her being kidnapped by me and my very Latinx friend that was also in the car. And I remember thinking to myself, while I'm sitting in the back seat, I'm like, this is what it's supposed to be like with law enforcement. They're supposed to ask questions about your wellness and your health and your safety, not allude to the fact that you have drugs, alcohol, or are trafficking another human in the vehicle. So it was just like this very mind-blowing sort of experience that isn't normal. Like, that's not how you're supposed to treat people of color in a regular traffic stop. And we've seen that happen time and time and time and time again, that it goes very violently and life-threatening for Black folks in this country, and unacceptably so, which is why I continue to do the work that I do. While these stories are very funny, some of the stories are funny, they are not without pain, trauma, or harm. There was another instance when I was coming out of the gas station in McCall, and I accidentally dropped 9mm rounds all over the floor of my little Toyota Paseo. A cop walked up just to ask, like, hey, what's going on? How's your day going? And I was like terrified of the fact that I was somehow doing something wrong because I'm picking up literal bullets off the floor of my car. And in fact, it turned out that this cop was just flirting with me, asked for my name and number, which I obviously didn't give to him because I'm thinking like I'm getting pulled over for something, when I was already pulled over in a parking lot in McCall, Idaho. So the way all of these stories and all of these anecdotes aren't singular to me, that every single Black or Indigenous or mixed race Black Indigenous person in Idaho has these experiences, and they're not out of the ordinary for us. And they're terrifying. Like, we can laugh about them in the after fact, but they literally are terrifying experiences. So while these first few stories and those first statements that I made at the beginning of this keynote lend themselves to this idea that I have this very like desperate, painful existence, it is not easy and it is unsafe to be Black and Indigenous in a woman's body in the United States, and even worse so if this were a trans body. I'm not. I'm cishet, identify as cishet female. I do have a mental illness and I have a service dog. So that does change the dynamic for me when I move in the world, but nothing like a trans Black or Indigenous body would face. All of that to say, where do we find joy? You know, where do we celebrate? What do we have to celebrate when we are facing this onslaught, this relentless onslaught of racism, marginalization, oppression, etc.? And you know, that's when the conversations get good. You know, I'm a believer in, because I'm an abolitionist. Abolition means that I believe our communities can work outside of our current punitive systems of criminal justice, which is not actually a justice system. We can provide for community a level of safety and security that is not provided by law enforcement, which is hyper-militaristic. And very often we see police officers and military men as perpetrators of violence against their intimate partners, against each other, and in their workplaces, et cetera. So as an abolitionist, I find a great deal of joy in being creative and innovative in the way that we address community care and the way that we address mutual aid. There's a great deal of joy in the way that we celebrate each other and uphold each other's work. Especially as community organizers, we have to do a lot of this work from the ground up. Grassroots is what they call that. And supporting each other and seeing each other come to fruition into these amazing events. International Women's Day coming up, the Black Liberation Collective, which in the LC Valley area helped one of your local activists and organizers put up the Black History Month billboards. So we were really proud and excited to see that, because that's a statewide organizing effort. I take a great deal of joy in that. I take a great deal of joy in Black and Indigenous artists, artists from beat makers to musicians to cooks and chefs, to beadwork artists, to dancers, to fine art, and to the poet that you had here the other night. His poetry is definitely so lovely, and our community is so very, very proud of him. There's moments of joy in those places also. I find moments of joy when I see my name in programs, especially the TED Talk program. I had a TED Talk 2 years ago down in Boise, and I was able to celebrate my family and my mother in those moments. And in those moments, I'm not just, those moments aren't just for me, they're for both my ancestors and for my descendants and as well. And keep in mind, like, my experience isn't this or that, black or white, black or indigenous. There's a lot of gray area and nuance in the way that I move through the world. Racial ambiguity makes for an adventurous roller coaster, and leaning into the adventure, I think, is what allows me to move with power and with intention, in my social movement work, in my social movement spaces. I think this might be a good time. I'm going to take a breath really quick, but I'm going to pivot us so I can tell you the story of my people. I will also tell you the story of my land. And then I will tell you the story of my life, or the story that I'm writing for the future. So those are some good pauses to have, because we have about 15 minutes before I take your questions. And if there are any questions right now, I'm happy to take them. I'll go ahead and pause for a second. And Marlo, I will mention.
Have any at the moment? Any questions?
Can you see them? Because it's not actually showing up where I think I should be able to see questions. So
yeah, it looks like the YouTube chat is not working. So I'll just remind people that if they want to email questions, I think we'll have some coming in.
Okay. And really quick, actually, because I want to do this a couple of different ways. How about people text me their questions also? That's going to be an interesting way to do it. So you said they have access to email?
Well, I can't guarantee that that our viewers have access to email.
Okay. And this allows your questions to be anonymous to me. So I'm going to hold this up right now for a minute. So your questions are going to be completely anonymous, but text your questions, because I'm staring at my message right now. And we apologize because the YouTube question or the YouTube chat feature is not functioning right now, but I want you to be able to have the opportunity to ask me questions. So this is the number that you can text. Your questions are going to remain anonymous unless, of course, you add your name to it or you want me to know who you are. Is there something about my identity that you want me to explore? Is there something about something that I've said that maybe feels aggressive or off-putting? I want you to lean into that. I want you to lean into that discomfort and ask me the question that's sitting with you. I prattle off quite a bit. I'm trying to give you my whole life story in under 35 minutes. So please excuse how fast I'm moving through these stories, how high level I have to move through these stories. But please know that I do want to take and honor your questions. I want to honor your curiosity if you have it today. So please feel free to text me. I'm staring at my phone. I'm staring at my messenger. If you have questions, please ask them. While I'm waiting for those, I'm going to tell you the story of my people. As a storyteller, I very often host story circles for a couple of different reasons. Storytelling is is the most direct and fulfilling connection between two people or two communities. And what I mean by that is when you share stories and you create space for stories to be shared, very often you find commonality, you find human connection, and you can move people into their heart space when they start to tell stories. So the prompt of tell me the story of your people is one of the prompts that I use to really allow folks to engage in a very meaningful human way in the conversations around who we are in social movement spaces. The story of my people. I told you, Enim Nixasa, Hiwis Timina Ilp Ilpkanich. I am a descendant of Chief Redheart of the Nimipu Nation. I also told you earlier that I am a descendant of a long line of powerful matriarchs. I am the daughter and the granddaughter of healers. I am the granddaughter and great-granddaughter of social civil rights activists on the Black side of my family out of Chicago that have co-founded NAACP chapters. My own father, highly militant and highly militant and empathizer of the Black Panthers. So there's any number of, like, civil rights is just something that feels genetic. I've been doing this since I was a child. And to tell you the story a little bit about the story of my name, I believe that I was named after my fifth great-grandmother, great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, also named Atit Watit, who did not live with our people when we were during the initial contact of Lewis and Clark. And during that time, oh, thank you all for these questions. And during that time, she would travel with trappers and settlers and pioneers and never lived with the people. Every few years, she would come back to our gathering sites, to our celebrations, to her family, and then teach her people what she was learning. That's a story and a parallel of my own life. I never grew up on the Indian reservation. I did get to spend a great deal of time living overseas and in larger cities like Chicago. And that afforded me some very real opportunities to learn and understand the world and then bring that knowledge back to my people when I did spend my summers and often holidays on the Nez Perce Indian Reservation. So I feel a very deep connection to my ancestors, and I feel a very huge responsibility to improve the way that the world works now for my descendants. And I believe that the work that I'm doing, albeit tireless and relentless, will in fact change the world. So that's my work, and that's the story of my people. So now that I see some of your questions coming in, I want to go ahead and address and take some of those. So the very first question that came in, can I talk more about my work with MMIW? How can people learn more and become more involved? And then you're asking about my journey to activism. So those are both very great questions. For those of you who are not familiar, MMIW and MMIP. MMIW is an acronym that stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. I got started in that movement work in about 2016. I believe I had seen a protest or a march in the Seattle area, maybe in the Toronto area, Toronto, Ontario. Like, I had started to see these very powerful, moving demonstrations of these families looking for these lost women. And at the time, Canada was doing what they could to build a national database. And the United States is still so very far behind that. And then once I saw the huge gaps in knowledge and what was taking place in both Canada and the United States, I felt moved to get involved and started to become very vocal. I did my best to create awareness events. I did my best to do, like, understand it from an academic standpoint too, because I'm a political scientist. Why is this a problem from a political science standpoint? Where are the policy gaps? Why are there no congressional appropriations to figure out why these women are missing? In the United States alone, we have 5,700 unsolved missing persons cases that involve Indigenous women. That's just missing women, not to mention the thousands of cold cases of Indigenous women now presumed dead. So this work is also very tireless. There's very little resources attached to finding Native American women when they do go missing, and the response and prevention mechanisms damn near don't exist. There are grassroots organizers who are really driving this work in a very powerful and meaningful way. And I want to shout out Roxanne White, based out of Seattle. She's Yakima and Nimipu doing this work. I want to shout out Jerry Muma, who addresses the sex trafficking portion of MMIW. There are some Two-Spirit folks who work at the Sovereign Bodies Institute who are doing this work also. And so Sovereign Bodies Institute, Urban Indian Health Institute out of Seattle, Those are some big ones. The Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women out of the Southwestern United States is another place to learn about MMIW. So just anywhere across the map. National Congress of American Indians has some academic approaches to missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so that's where my work falls in line, especially in my domestic violence and sexual assault advocacy work. How can we prevent and how do we respond quickly to survivors and to survivor families? If you follow the Indigenous Idaho Alliance on Facebook, we also have several awareness events. We've done some film screenings and we do some fundraising so that when families have emergency needs to respond to missing loved ones, we're able to just throw cash at them versus like a nonprofit, which needs you to fill out paperwork and you got to submit W-9s and you got to do all of the, like nobody needs that when you're trying to find your family member, because we all know that every single minute counts. So thank you so much for that question. Do I think teachers are getting better at teaching history more inclusively, and what resources or advice do you have for making it better? You know, I gotta give you a lot of credit. If you are a teacher for K through 12, you have the systems of settler colonialism and white supremacy and Western academia are literally squeezing as much out of you with very, very few resources when it comes to teaching. I think teachers are highly undervalued, highly underserved, highly under-resourced. So I'm going to name those things. Because of that, I do not think that teachers are able to are getting better at teaching more inclusively, because you just don't have the room or the resources to do it. You're dictated to as far as what curriculum needs to be taught and you have a very quantitative approach that needs to be met rather than a human needs approach to teaching. So those are my observations, and keep in mind, like, this is entirely from my decolonizer, anarchist, abolitionist lens. Until resources are adequately allocated across the board, especially in underserved Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, there is no inclusivity in K through 12 teaching. Professors can't, like in an academic setting, do have some more wiggle room, but it does depend on the university. And those universities don't often support, except on face value, those professors who are really trying to implement radically inclusive academic curricula. So those are, again, just my insights and just what I found. I'm very often brought in as a guest lecturer, so like 1 or 2 hours per semester per course somewhere. Like I did one for Selkirk College a couple weeks ago. I've done several for Boise State over the last few years. But why am I only teaching 1 or 2 hours when there should be a whole class dedicated to social movement, social justice, abolition, radical inclusion? Radical inclusion could be its own curricula for teaching. So there are several changes that still need to be made when it comes to education standards. Do I ever feel, okay, this is a really great question. How do you deal with people becoming angry after you share your experiences and the truth? And do I ever feel excluded from my tribe or Black communities as a person of mixed race? Yes, this is really just, you're asking the brunt of my time with you. I deal with whiteness under stress constantly. I'm constantly trying to mop up the ocean when it comes to white folks and encouraging them to be anti-racist, not non-racist or racist, just I want folks to be actively, intentionally anti-racist. In addition to that, I do face a great deal of xenophobia and prejudice within the Black community. And also I have to deal with anti-Blackness in the Indigenous community. So some of those statements I had read off earlier were said by Native women to me or to my mother. Some of those things that were said to me about wearing my hair straight was said to me by a Black man. Like, I can't, like, there are just so many things, so many microaggressions that I endure. And think about microaggressions this way. You can get a paper cut and it doesn't bother you, right? You've got a paper cut and like when you wash your hands, you can tell it's there. But microaggressions, when those things are said to me in just this onslaught and these waves, it's several 100,000 tiny cuts over the course of my life that never have the opportunity to heal. And so I always constantly feel like an outsider from everywhere. And that is a really difficult and painful existence for me that I'm still trying to unpack. I'm 37 years old now, and I don't have an easy answer for you other than I have to really work at finding a home for myself. I've built myself a community, of beloved community of Black, Brown, and Indigenous activists and organizers. My own family is very strong and very loving and very powerful. So when I go home, my cup is filled up and I have room to be safe and take naps and do nothing. So there's also that. But I always feel a sense of having to prove my indigeneity to my Native American side, and then having to I show up as acting white when it comes to my Black side. So that becomes very, very nuanced and very, very complicated for me. And I range the gamut of emotions from frustration and resentment to despair and isolation and loneliness to joyfulness. Again, matriarchy and Black girl magic at the same time. How lucky am I to carry both of those things? So it's a both and. Yes, all the truths can exist. Very complicated. But early in the pandemic last year, I was able, with the Sovereign Bodies Institute, to sit on a panel where the discussion was the intersections or the commonality between missing and murdered Indigenous women's social justice work and Black Lives Matter social justice work. And every single woman on this call was both mixed race, Black, and Indigenous. And it was the most life-affirming, life-giving space I had ever been in, to be with all of these other activists who look like me, who talk like me, who sound like me, whose experiences and vision are shared by me. And it was very, very powerful. And I think that we have an opportunity to do that and create those spaces for young people. And I'm talking those who are 5, 10, 15 years old. If they are mixed race, put them in a room with other mixed race children that is devoid of the anti-Blackness and the xenophobia and the prejudice, internalized racism. Like help them see themselves and help them be affirmed in their mixed race identity, that they absolutely do not have to choose. And you're also, that question also brings up another story for me. When I was very young and started to become racially self-aware, I had a couple of folks over the course of my life ask me, well, which one do I identify with more? Do I identify more Black or do I identify more Indigenous? And that was always a really difficult question for me. But I talked to my Indigenous grandma, Inem Nakats, about what it meant to be Black and be Native. And she was really supportive about it. She just asked me really quietly. She's like, well, which one of your grandmothers would you deny? And that was such a beautiful and powerful question. Which of my grandmothers would I deny? And I love them so much. I loved how beautiful my Black grandmother was and how ferocious she was and how much of an avid reader she was. And I love my Native grandmother because of the languages she spoke, and she took us sweat and she took us powwow and all of the incredible adventures we had with her. So why would I deny either of my grandmothers for the opinion and the comfort of somebody else? People ask that for their own comfort. They don't ask it for my comfort. Which one do I choose more or less? Like, first of all, biology doesn't work that way. My mom is Native American and my dad is Black. Like biologically speaking, you don't get to choose one or the other. So at that point when I was young, I was able to be self-aware and self-affirmed in that I don't have to choose, because I'm not denying either grandmother in either case. So thank you so much. That was actually a really great question. I love that question. I'm going to circle back to the journey to activism. Am I passionate about feminism? I'm not a feminist. I am a matriarch. So there's a difference there. You're actually bringing up, I'm going to write a book about this someday. Feminism in the United States, as we know it, is based on white women's rights. And because of that, my understanding of critical race theory and intersectionality would have me be bought into womanism, coined Black woman, or matriarchy. And what matriarchy is about, especially in tribes who practice matriarchy, is that I don't have rights. I have a responsibility to serve. And that's where those 3 tenets that Marlo had introduced, keeping nature in balance, protecting the sacred, and giving back to the community. Those are my responsibilities to my people. And that's what it is to be a matriarch. Like, there is the assumption that I have rights. Like, our communities have never relegated women to substandard or subpar citizens or secondary citizens. So in Indigenous communities, I'm thankful in particular, that women are always empowered and women always have a strong voice. And because we are empowered and because we have the strong voice already, we're not fighting for rights. We are ensuring that we fulfill our responsibility to our people. So yes, I am damn passionate about my role as a baby matriarch at this point. So that's a great question as well. Thank you so much. And feminism and racism, womanhood and racism, matriarchy and racism meet at the intersections of oppression and marginalization. I don't think you can have a conversation about race unless you are uplifting the voices of Black, Brown, and Indigenous women and femme folks, especially Black trans femmes. So that, I feel like, is a TED Talk for a different day. And thank you, Marlo, for adding those questions. My journey to activism, I kind of mentioned it in the story of my people. Because my grandparents were activists, because my father was so Afrocentric, because my mom is all fury and love, I never had the opportunity to do or be anything except a proponent of social justice, except a person who strives to make things equal for myself and for others. Over the course of my life, equal turned into equitable, because equal and equitable are not the same thing. And then, later on in life, into my early 30s, I started to radicalize in a way where I wanted radical inclusion, not just for myself as a Black Indigenous woman. I want radical inclusion for those at the intersections of ability, neurodiversity, language, justice, immigration status, age. Like, we talk about really like needing youth voices, but don't actually empower, center, or uplift youth voices. We're very ageist in many of our systems. So because of that, because I have these really powerful influences in my life was always about, how can I take what I'm learning, how can I take what I'm doing and make sure that it is in service to the community, to make it more equitable, to make it more truthful, and to make it more just. So those are my three: truth, justice, and love are my big philosophies, like so much so that I have all three of those words tattooed on each of these fingers: truth, justice, love. But thank you so much. That's such an incredible question. My roadmap to activism. There's a big event in Boise called Story Fort and Tree Fort, and I actually hosted a podcast with three of my co-conspirators about our journeys to activism. I'm sure I can send that link to Marlo to be able to send to all of the participants and attendees this evening. All right, where are we at? What do we've got? With the disproportionate amount of POC incarcerated, what are some of your ideas to improve the system? I don't believe that the system can be improved. That's what abolition is about. I believe that we need to defund the police. I believe that we need to reinvest in communities. So if you think for a second about the safest communities in the United States, those safest communities don't have more police. They have more resources: clean roads, access to transit systems, better schools, etc., better hospitals, better mental health care facilities. I will repeat that for you. The safest communities in the United States do not have more police. They have more resources. So that's something that's a very important distinction that we need to make. Our system of law enforcement and incarceration in the United States has never been about equity or equitable justice. The history of law enforcement in this country was about ensuring slave labor and making sure slaves didn't run away. So with a sordid history like that, trying to improve that system is to just dismantle it and rebuild to something where community safety is actually couched in the community. And the follow-up to that was, I know many tribal cultures favor the concept of restoration and reconciliation. Do I think that this is something that could be applied to the current punitive system? What are your suggestions? Yes, restoration and reconciliation absolutely happened, but in Indigenous communities, you got to remember, none of that was punitive. It was never about isolating somebody away from community. It was about restoring them back into the community. So yes, if there are resources allocated to restoration programs, giving those who choose to use violence jobs in the community, those who are criminalized for homelessness, giving them a place to live and giving them a job, that's also going to minimize the incarcerated population. There's any number of, oh man, I could prattle off and on and on and on about this. I would recommend looking at the number 8 to abolition, 8to abolition.com. Believe it's .com, and you can see some of those suggestions and talking points around what are the alternatives to the punitive justice system that we currently have. That is a hard question that you've asked with a mixed race son. I'm going to put a pin in that and try to circle back with what time we have left. What are my recommendations for those students who are here in a difficult position? Describe being the sole POC LGBTQ person in the room. Oh, that's an easy answer. For some reason, colonization would have us believe that we are required to do the work, do the emotional and intellectual labor. So if you are the only one of somebody in the room, know that you do not have to answer. You do not have to be the pillar of knowledge in that space. You can say no, you can back out and not participate. It's an opt-in, opt-out. You are not responsible for educating your peers of a different identity group at all. Like, everybody carries a smartphone around. The reason why I'm able to accept and field your questions today is because of smartphones and technology. There's no reason anybody shouldn't be able to have access to that knowledge in the same way that you have had access to that knowledge and lived experience. So please don't ever feel obligated to support the learning around your identity. That's not your responsibility. And that being said, asserting that to the professor, like, I am uncomfortable with being the sole XYZ identity in the room, and then now feeling an obligation to support the learning of my peers. I wish somebody had told me or given me permission to say that out loud to a professor when I was in college, because I would have been 1,000 times less triggered, and I may have actually enjoyed my college experience then. Oh, and the second piece to that, find community and never let that community go in college. If you're the only one in the room, but there are 2 or 3 of you on campus, please build community together. Make sure y'all are nourished and eat and drink water. Make sure that you have spaces that are just your own. You don't have to invite, your straight friend all the time. You don't have to invite, the white friend all the time. It is important for folks who share identity to be in that identity group for their own wellness and for their own safety. That is the revolution, y'all. That's a great question. Although there are so many barriers for professors trying to teach inclusively, is there anything you think they can actually do better? Yes, get elected to school boards so that the books are better. Get elected to commissions, get elected to boards, get elected, like, use your voice in places where decisions are being made. And then also use your influence, push the boundaries of your container in your own classrooms. I've actually seen and heard of a few teachers doing that as well. And don't invite me into your classroom, right? Like, for some reason, there are some teachers who think that inclusivity means inviting the XYZ Black person or the XYZ Indigenous person in to talk about Blackness or to talk about indigeneity. No, that's not how it's done. Exposure is important. However, again, Black and Indigenous people, Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are not responsible for the learning of those who are not of that identity group. And read all of the books and listen to all of the podcasts. Our experiences are recorded as beautiful art, beautiful prose, beautiful poetry. Use that in your classroom. That's the exposure, because what we understand is, like, the Western lit canon doesn't include Native American literature. Why not? This is literally our homeland. Like, we are everything that is Western. And it just, like, there are some things that are just kind of mind blowing and mind numbing to me, in that what's considered common knowledge for Indigenous people is now niche knowledge or outside of the norm knowledge for non-natives. So be creative in the way that you're delivering knowledge, get elected to boards where decisions are being made, and push the boundaries of your own containers in your workspaces. So those are kind of my high level recommendations there. Let's see. You have a mixed race Black son and you're trying to find community for them. Take them to the res. There are plenty of Black and Brown and Indigenous kids on the res. And I say that jokingly, but I'm serious. Like, that's where all the Black and Brown folks and Indigenous folks is on the res. And there's not a lack of, they're there. They just, it's a shit show outside. Like, I don't like to go to Lewiston much. Like, when I go to visit my family, I don't go into Lewiston on purpose because of that reason, because of the fact that I feel unsafe. So until safer spaces are created in public in Lewiston, I wouldn't recommend your son going outside anyway, but go to the rest. There's some really great folks out there. Powwows are always open. Basketball is always open. There's a community center when there's not a pandemic outside, for sure, but but I do understand there is a very small Black community in Lewiston. I hated it when I lived up there, but I found a Black community to be with. I found the basketball players took me in as their little wayward fan. Like, any number of those opportunities, but there are no easy suggestions. Honestly, I think that for a young Black person to grow up in the LC Valley is doing them a disservice. Please take that with a grain of salt, because I am not a parent. Take that as I've been a lot of places in my life and in the world where there are much more fulfilling and affirming places for a Black child to grow up. And I've grown up in those places, fortunately. Yeah. So thank you for that question. Let's see. I don't have any other questions. I don't think. Please bump your question to the top of my inbox if you didn't hear me answer it. I'm going to take a breather for a second. We've got about 5 minutes, right, Marlo? Is that where we're at?
Yeah, I think that sounds about right. And I don't think I have any more questions for you at the moment. I put all of the ones I had in the chat.
Thank you. Those were great questions. And again, the preface here is I have given you very high level, shortened, abridged, nutshell versions of these experiences. And I know that can make it very, that could actually lend itself to more questions. So just know that I recognize and honor that you want to know more, and we just are constrained by time. I do have a workshop tomorrow, which I'm excited to be a part of, where I actually, some of these how-to questions y'all are asking, or what about this question, or, the kind of checklist, or look at, how do we address some of these problems that I've discussed. That's where that workshop space is going to be valuable. I hope will be valuable to you. And you're going to get facilitator Ty, where there's going to be a lot of participation. So please join me tomorrow if you do want to dig a little bit deeper into your questions, and then get some more like tools and skill set on how to address these issues, for sure.
Well, Ty, I would just like to thank you for being with us here tonight. This was so wonderful, and you've given us so much to think about. And I think that many of the viewers for tonight's program will probably have more questions that they hope to unpack with you in the workshop tomorrow. If there is anyone who does not have the link to the workshop and you would like to attend that, shoot me an email at hmdailygalliano, and I will send you the Zoom link to that workshop. Ty, is there anything you would like to say in closing before we end tonight's wonderful program?
Oh, thank you. I think that here's what I will offer. I know that I've given a very abridged version of my experience and of my life, but the thing that if you never talk to me or hear from me ever again in your lives, here's what I want you to take away. I have lived a very vibrant and dynamic life, and the work that I'm doing is in the relentless pursuit of justice, truth, and love. That I have a big vision for the world 10, 20, 100 years from now, where we all live with abundance and we all live with thriving, and we call that place like the place of radical liberation. And so that's the work. I'll keep continuing to do the work. I do it for my descendants, and I do it for your descendants also. And I am very thankful that you shared this space with me this evening.
Thank you so much.